Welcome to Lou Palumbo's Between the Lines. Problem solving for our future. Lou. Common sense, logic, and reasoning. Lou. The man that can't stand hate and animus. Lou. Stimulating the thought process of America. Lou. Where being right is not political, it's factual. Lou. Providing real solutions in real time. And now, here's your host, Lou Palumbo.
We're back again. Hopefully we'll stimulate some thought here, bring everyone to the realization that we have a crisis in this country on many fronts. I do remind everyone the purpose in putting forth this project is out of concern for our children. I'm not quite sure what kind of future we're going to leave them. I'm not sure what shape we're going to leave this country in the not too distant future as well. All you have to do is read a little bit, turn on the news a little bit, and just listen a little bit. And I do say this to you as always, never be spoon-fed by anything you hear from me, and for that matter, and perhaps even more importantly, the 24-hour news cycle, which are all politically attached to their topics. This isn't about truth, honor, integrity anymore. It's about agenda. And as I said to you, our children are going to pay for this. I remind everyone, without prejudice, look at the condition of your borders, your major cities. Look at your economy. Look at your foreign policies that we're executing throughout the world, including this recent withdrawal from Afghanistan. We have issues here, and the unfortunate part of this discussion is that there doesn't seem to be any inclination to resolve them in a form of compromise. We're going to get into today, I suspect, this shooting in Uvalde, Texas, which is tragic, to put it to you politely. We're going to have as a guest the gentleman, Doctor Anthony Fleming, who is a professor, undergraduate and graduate courses at the University of West Georgia. He's written a number of books also, which we'll get into a little bit. His primary area of study has been gun control policies in the United States and Canada. In particular, he focuses on the reaction of policymakers, interest groups, the media, and the public on major gun violence episodes. So we're hoping to bring him in shortly. This is going to be an interesting discussion. As usual, for whatever reason, the truth to this topic of shootings in America has left the conversation. Again, it's all politically driven by agenda and without any sight of resolution to this problem. I want to say one thing that I think is important for people to just think about. I always believe there's no such thing as single causality. Something has happened to the psyche of the American youth, especially post-1998 Columbine. I happened to have been in Columbine the day after the shooting with a very high-profile client, and it's just tragic to see the path we're on, the trajectory that this country is on with our children. But interestingly enough, in a bigger sense, this has become a critique of America. You know, we're talking about having conversations where we need to put armed people in the academic environments of your children. We need to ballistically protect them with ballistic glass. We need to put in devices like shot spotting, which can triangulate the discharge of a firearm within 1 meter. Interesting critique of our country. Your sense of decency should be offended. I don't know what else to say to you. I do want to get on with the show. I want to thank our sponsors, Instacart and Buzzsprout. I actually utilize both of them. The platform for which this show was launched was in fact Buzzsprout, and it's very, very user-friendly if you think you want to get on the internet and put a podcast together. So I would like to, at this point, have a conversation with Dr. Anthony Fleming. I have a feeling it's going to be rather interesting because there's a lot of middle ground in discussion as to what's taking place in this country, and in particular with our youth and firearms. I just think it's responsible to tell the public that the Founding Fathers, in constructing the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, your Bill of Rights, the second most important amendment on their agenda was your right to bear arms. It really isn't about guns, it's about your freedom. They realized that the firearm liberated this country, put it on its path. They were further concerned about tyranny and foreign invaders, which we're witnessing in real time in the Ukraine. And oh, by the way, in 1812, the British made another run at us when they burnt the White House. I hear comments made about the founding fathers would have never endorsed firearms if they knew they were going to be like these AR-15s or these M4s or all these high-capacity automatic weapons. I think the founding fathers would have taken a position that firearms would be, how would you say, part of the culture in sync with the times. By the way, it wasn't the American public that developed the firearms. It was individual companies, individual people like Sam Colt and the Smith & Wesson family and Ruger, for example, out of Connecticut. It wasn't any single individual. It was about developing weapons for the purpose of protection and repelling assault and engaging in war, which is a whole other discussion, this preoccupation we've had since the beginning of mankind to kill one another. I just don't understand it. I don't know why we're not putting our energies into better areas, but it is what it is. So I'm going to take a quick break, and I'm going to introduce our caller again, Doctor Anthony Fleming. He is a professor, undergraduate, and graduate studies, University of West Georgia. We'll be right back. Instacart, another interesting concept. You can go to your favorite grocery stores, sign on to their application without leaving your home, the comfort of your home. Just pick out the items you'd like. They'll assign a personal shopper for you and deliver them to the point that you would like them delivered to. Another great concept, very user-friendly, and I'll be honest, we use it also. It's very effective, and they're very, very good. They're very on point. Hello?
Hello, this is Anthony Fleming.
Dr. Fleming, how are you?
I'm doing pretty well. How are you?
Good. I gather you're comfortably situated in Georgia somewhere, or am I wrong?
Yeah, I'm in Carrollton, Georgia. I'm at the University of West Georgia. I'm actually sitting in my office currently.
Are you a native to Georgia, sir?
No, I grew up in a hollow in West Virginia.
No kidding. My wife's from West Virginia. That's where she was born.
Oh, really? Yeah, I grew up in a little town called Sissonville.
Yeah, I don't know much about West Virginia. Her father was a colonel in the Air Force during Vietnam, and of course they moved quite a bit, among other places, the Dakotas, obvious reasons, and then they settled permanently in Tallahassee, Florida. I don't want to bore you with this less than stimulating conversation for the listener. Let me ask you, give us a little bit of your background. Just give me a quick overview of your background.
So I received my PhD from West Virginia University in political science back in 2010. My research is almost exclusively on firearms, and particularly the policy response to them. So I wrote my dissertation comparing the United States and Canada and how they respond to mass murder events or assassinations. Then that evolved over time into looking how we talk about and frame the debate on firearms in a way that we try to get our side to win, whether we're being gun rights activists or gun control activists. And right now, me and a co-author of mine are working on a book where we look at the historical evolution of the debate from both the individualistic side, which is your pro-gun folks, versus the communitarian side, which is your pro-control folks, and how they've each kind of used words to shape the debate over time to try to get.
Yeah. It's interesting, Anthony. I'm hearing what you're saying, and it's quite interesting. But, the one thing I come away with is that with all the clever usage of verbiage, it never steps away from the truth on this topic. And I'm interested to know what was it about the firearm that, caught your attention, that you would devote so much of your career, your educational endeavors and your publications. What is it about the firearm?
So I grew up in, let's say, very rural West Virginia. I've always been into hunting, but I've never been. So my co-author, he's very interested in firearms. I'm always been very interested.
When you
in
say
hunting.
You have to qualify that for me. So when you say interested in firearms, from the standpoint of embracing them, studying them, because there's a lot of ways you could be interested in topics, and firearms are not a departure. I have an interesting interest in firearms. I have an interesting interest in things that we've been developing since the beginning of time to harm one another. And I'm actually extremely knowledgeable in weapons because of background. But go ahead, sir.
That's fair. So one of the biggest, I remember when I was in graduate school, to try to answer your question more specifically, when I was in graduate school, I asked my professors constantly, why after a shooting like Columbine, why after what happened to Virginia Tech, why aren't we passing gun control laws? And they were like, well, it's the NRA, stupid. This is essentially. And I was like, yeah, but it seems like there should be more to it than that. And they didn't have a satisfactory answer for me. So that's what got me wanting to understand why firearms policy is the way that it is. So that's what started it.
Okay, so I just want to ask you one other question. Based on what you just volunteered regarding, referencing Columbine, for example, another instance that followed, you believe that regulating firearms is going to fix this problem or address this problem or make it go away? Is that your theory?
I don't know what's going to fix the problem, frankly.
Well, let me help you with that. How about a truthful approach to what's changed in America? I want to just say something to you that you may already know. These firearms have existed in this country probably over 220 years before Columbine hit. And there were some one-offs, to be honest with you, Dr. Fleming. You mind if I call you Anthony?
Yes, fine.
And call me Lou. So I want to make this a little more friendly and less formal. We skipped along for over 220 years without real incidents or patterns of usage of these firearms. Interestingly enough, Anthony, this weapon that they're now vilifying, the AR-15 or the M4, however you would like to refer to it, they like to call it an assault weapon. The pro-gun people call it a sporting rifle. I'm not getting caught in that argument. But the thing I want to tell you that you might find interesting is that they released it for public consumption in the 1960s by Colt Firearms Industry. The weapon was developed by Eugene Stoner. It was originally referred to as the Armalite, or AR, AR-15, M16. M16 is a military rendition of it that has a capability of firing full automatic. That weapon was in this culture being circulated for consumption for over 35 years before Columbine hit. And if I recall correctly, at Columbine, there was no use of an assault-style weapon. They used, devices, explosive devices, and other forms of weaponry. Now, I do want you to understand one thing, Anthony. I'm not necessarily arguing that we need an approach to regulating who gets weapons. I'm playing a little bit of devil's advocate. I'm giving you the argument, a lot of which truth is rooted in. So here's the question I ask you first, sir. Post-1998, and I was in Columbine the next day with Sarah Ferguson, the Duchess of York. She's been my client. We're in L.A. Post-1998, I think you would agree with me that we've been on a roll, would you not say? That we're banging them out left, right, and center with these mass shootings. Would you agree?
Well, they're accelerating, yes. Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely.
So here's a question I want to ask you. Do you think the culture changed, or did the gun change? And that doesn't take me away from acknowledging the fact that we need a whole different approach, even if you're pro-gun, to how weapons are acquired in this country today. Because, as you probably know, our population grew from 1970 to current by 135 million people. And I would say, along with that, are the problems exponentially. You see my point? So my question is, we've been on a roll. We've had a pattern since Columbine up to present. We had a 3-year lapse, in a sense, because of or 2 years with this pandemic, but we've been in high gear. Did the culture change? Did the mental health of this country diminish? Or did the gun change? You see, and I think the most important part of this conversation, I don't mean you in specific, but in general this conversation, is that we have a truthful, open-minded approach. With the advent of video games, social media, failed parenting, Hollywood, bullying in school, a loss of authority of teachers in schools, we have a problem with our young people in particular. So I'm curious to hear what your response would be, based on what I just volunteered.
Are you familiar with Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone?
What's the book, sir?
Bowling Alone.
No.
So I read this book in graduate school, and it's kind of prophetic, and it might be something that it has nothing to do with the guns, just to be frank. But what Putnam argues, if I remember correctly, in kind of a nutshell, is that people are bowling less and less in groups. We're starting to bowl alone because what's happening is community is breaking down. And because community is breaking down, we're finding other avenues for community. So instead of your local community, I'm in Carrollton, Georgia. So for me, if in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, you don't have other avenues of community. Your community is your community. You don't have the access to the internet. You don't have the access to Facebook. You don't have the access to Twitter. You have your community. So if you have aberrant thoughts, you almost have to start working on complying back in with your community, because you're going to be almost forced into it, right, by those that you're around. However, as internet comes about, what we find is if we have aberrant viewpoints that are different than others, we may not find that we fit into our local community, but we can find local communities out there on the internet somewhere who we can identify with. And sometimes those groups are good and sometimes those groups are bad. And I think that social media, not social media in like specific aspects of it, but social media in the fact that we can use that as another means of community, and that community can be hate groups to like reinforce negative viewpoints or racist feelings, or the desire to shoot children in schools. I think that has a lot to do with it. Now, is that the only variable? No, because it's too complicated a problem. But I think that when you talk about how we've accelerated over time with the mass murders with firearms, I think that the breakdown of community is a lot of it.
I agree with you, sir, in that statement. I think that you just touched on one of the contributing factors to this discussion. And as I always believe, there's no such thing as single causality. I may have mentioned that. I think this is a cumulative product, Anthony, of societal breakdown, parenting breakdown. I think video games especially. Have you had the opportunity ever to take a look at any of these video games that are available to these young kids? Have you ever seen any like Call of Duty or Grand Theft Auto? Have you ever seen any of these?
So to be fair, I've played a bunch of them.
I appreciate your honesty. So you know firsthand exactly what can seep into the mind of a very developing person, you know, a youthful person at 12 or 13 or 14 or 10 or 11. These are the ages these kids are playing these games. We're teaching them about firearms, the different types, weapon systems, tactics. You know, I don't understand what we didn't understand, what we were doing to the psyche of our children. But it's interesting. You played them. So what did you come away with after you played them? What's your impressions? How harmful are they?
So okay, I'm going to maybe disagree with you some. So one of the things about people, how I feel about, okay, let me back up. I'm sorry. I'm going like three different ways at once in my head. To me, a lot of the time, especially when I'm older as an adult, I think that when you play a violent video game, some of the research I've read, it actually provides a cathartic effect. If you're shooting fake people on the screen, it might make you feel better and you don't feel like you need to shoot fake real people, right? However, the problem is when you talk about mass shooters, so if you have 99 out of 100 people play a mass video or a video game like Call of Duty, and it provides a cathartic effect, that's one thing. But the problem is the person who's going to be doing the mass murders is going to be that 1 out of 100 because they're aberrant anyway. So will a video game lead them to shoot up a school potentially? Could it be like AC/DC? What was it? The Night Stalker. He said that the song Night Stalker is what led him. So you had music. So what tips someone off? Is it a video game? Is it a song? Is it the color of the sky on a particular day? I don't know. I think a lot of these are contributing factors. Again, because when you look at mass murderers, they aren't the normal person. They are the aberration. They are the outlier. So to understand the outlier is where we get complicated. Does that make sense what I'm trying to say?
It does. It does. And we're going to take a quick break, Anthony, and we're going to come right back to you. Ladies and gentlemen, I have with us today Doctor Anthony Fleming. Tremendous amount of insight and interest in what's going on in America, in particular with these mass shootings. We're going to be right back, guys. Just stick with me. So let me tell you a little bit about Buzzsprout. Very interesting concept. Basically, it allows you to set up your own podcast. One of the most advantageous things about using Buzzsprout is it's user-friendly. So I encourage you highly, if your inclination is to create your own podcast, please look into Buzzsprout. And by the way, we use it. We're back, and I have with me today Dr. Anthony Fleming. He is a professor, both undergraduate and graduate, at the University of West Georgia, and he has a rather interesting interest in these occurrences that involve firearms in our country, along with the mass shootings. To go back to what you said, I do buy into that to a degree. You know, the problem is a lot of this is theory, and you touched on something interesting. Let's say it's cathartic for 99 people, and as you just mentioned, we had that one off. You know, there are other common denominators to that individual's background that we need to start to take a look at. And I want to say one thing, Anthony, you know, I have always gotten into this position, and I'm an academic myself. I was a philosophy major in college, and I had 21 credits in political science, which I guess makes me a minor. I have a tendency not to intellectualize these problems, to be candid with you. My purpose is just to kind of problem solve and then go back and visit for the purpose of betterment, you know, long term. I think if I were going to speak, for example, just to go to this topic regarding gun control, first of all, they need to drop this word control and introduce the term management. It's a little softer on the ear. But I've said, starting over 20 years ago, and I know you don't know that much about me, but I've been doing interviews for probably close to 23, 24 years. CNN, Fox, MSNBC, NBC, ABC. You pick them, I've talked to them. And over 20 years ago, right around the times of the shooting with Malvo and Williams, D.C., I was talking about why aren't people requested or required to go through the same screening process that we go through in law enforcement. I'm a retired law enforcement agent. In my day, they called it Minnesota multiphasic screening, Rorschach, word association, and then interviews with psychologists and psychiatrists. If that mechanism had been in place, the young man in Uvalde, the young man in Parkland, highly likely they would have never gotten their hands on firearms. Now, I think you will agree with me, we're at an impasse culturally between the guys that like guns and the guys that don't like guns, none of which serves us. But I'm curious your assessment of what I just said to you about this process. And before I let you answer it, I want to tell you about a quick experience where it was actually worked in place. 1994, I moved from Malibu, California. Don't ask me why. It was awesome up there. To Manhattan Beach, which was also spectacular. And I went into the office of the chief of police in Manhattan Beach, which was the issuing agency for your concealed weapons permit, which I needed for work purposes in the state of California. Gentleman's name was Ernie Klebeschall. Never forget this man. Sat down, just a great guy. He just said to me kind of point blank, he goes, Lou, I want to help you get this concealed weapons permit, but this is what you have to do. Ready? I went through the whole psychological screening phase with the same mechanism that screened LAPD and Manhattan Beach Police Department's police officers. I did it for the first issuance of the permit, which was good for 2 years. When it lapsed to get reissued, I had to go through it again. I went through it 5 times. So I'm not speaking out of something that I didn't experience and that I know works. So my question to you now is, hearing what I just said, what are your impressions on my comments?
So one of the most difficult aspects about the United States when it comes to our policy with firearms, in my opinion, is the Second Amendment gives us the right to own a firearm. And because it's a right, it makes it difficult to regulate. So a state like California and New York have more ability to regulate firearms. Now, I know that historically, if you look at the Supreme Court, how they just ruled on the Second Amendment, they've said, they kind of waffled. They didn't really want to take it up until you get McDonald versus Chicago and DC versus Heller, which the Supreme Court says now we really are incorporating the Second Amendment, that it is a individual right. And that rights argument is where it gets complicated, because I think rights are hard to regulate universally. And when you start adding stipulations to them, it makes it more and more difficult, right? So do I necessarily think it's a bad idea to have some form of competency for you to own a firearm? No, I 100%. I understand that. I get it. But because it's a right, it makes it extremely hard to implement laws on that, especially when you start talking about your more conservative states. And to me, I think that one of the things I think when we talk about gun control policy in the United States, or gun management policy, as you suggested, is federalism. Because a state like California can have very strict laws in place for you to get a concealed weapon permit. But in my home state of West Virginia, you have a natural right to carry concealed anymore. You don't need to go through anything. If you're a resident of West Virginia, you can carry concealed.
It's called constitutional carry. We have at least 25 states right now, Anthony, that have passed that through their state legislature, and it's knocking on Florida's door right now. The governor here, DeSantis, would like to pass that law here. The most recent, ironically, was Georgia. Georgia was just most recently introduced to this constitutional carry. Indiana, last year, Texas, September 1st. I'm very familiar with what you're talking about, and I have to tell you, I have some very mixed emotions about that for reasons I'm sure you can appreciate. But I want you to continue with your comments, sir.
Oh, yeah. So the federalism argument makes it difficult because it's hard to have universal policy in the United States whenever states have so much control over policy making when it comes to firearms, and it's so disparate from one state to the next. I say West Virginia, as you say, the constitutional carry versus much more restrictive laws in California, New York, and it's just complicated. And that's I'm not sure I can provide much more clarity for myself because it's just complicated. And
well, that's where the word, Anthony, that's where the word compromise comes in. You see, you're right. You're 100%. You're spot on in this conversation. But what I'm suggesting is that for the sake of the safety of our children, at least our children, that we come to some type of middle ground here. I understand exactly what you're saying. I agree with what you're saying, and you're right. It's a complicated problem. But what's interesting is that this is a right that you have as a result of a constitutional amendment. I don't know why the federal government doesn't intercede and set up a mandate of a certain background vetting, like I just alluded to. In other words, I understand the states have rights. Normally, if something is not alluded to in the Constitution, right, kind of like abortion, which is the slippery slope we're having right now with the Supreme Court justice, it's going to be pushed back to the states to manage. But firearms are mentioned in our Constitution, and I don't know why the federal government doesn't take a bit more proactive stance in establishing guidelines here. In other words, if the federal government sets a guideline, a state may put into something more stringent, but not less. But we're not doing anything with this topic, Anthony. That's the whole problem. Mm-hmm. We're not going to any kind of conversation that will lend itself to a compromise that both people will walk away happy. If you allow me just 1 second, along with the fact that I think we should vet everyone before they ask for a high-capacity automatic pistol or this sporter rifle or assault rifle, depending on which side of the aisle you're sitting on, we should allow you to carry it throughout the United States. We would give you a permit that would allow you to carry concealed throughout the United States, the District of Columbia, and the U.S. territories. We always have an exemption for some reason with the Canal Zone. And by the way, that's something under which I currently carry a firearm as a retired law enforcement officer. They call it LEOSA, the Law Enforcement Officer Safety Act. So why not start the conversation at least? We're just sitting here paralyzed. And you know what my concern is? This shooting's going to go past in a few days. It's going to hit past our attention span, and we're going to go right back to business as usual, and it's only a matter of time till we have another episode like this. And we're going to go into another mode of not problem solving. But you know what? That seems to be the forte of the government today and any myriad of topics. It isn't just gun control. They don't know how to control crime in our major cities. We talk about gun control. Just for the record, I'm from New York City. We had 23 shootings over Memorial Day weekend. Chicago had over 50. These are both highly restrictive gun states. So what's wrong with this discussion here, folks? It's the ineptitude of this government. It's an ability to come to middle ground on topics that are critically important to us today. We're losing children in our inner cities as collateral damage as you and I are on the phone. I didn't even mention the number of people that are being slashed or stabbed and pushed in front of subways in New York City. So I'd be curious, what your take is on the comments I just made.
So one of the things that I think that we get really frustrated with government is one of the things you talk about is why can't government compromise? And you talk about the actors within government. I mean, you have two clearly divided party lines with the Republicans and the Democrats. And they've never, I never say never, but it seems like in recent times they've become less and less willing to compromise on anything, not just with firearms policy, but anything. And you have the Republicans on the right who are not going to budge when it comes to anything that restricts firearms. And then the Democrats have been kind of scared of attacking firearms policy since 94 with Clinton, whenever Clinton blamed the House getting taken over by the Republicans on the NRA. And the NRA fully embraced being blamed because, hey, now we get street cred for. So the Democrats have been kind of concerned about taking up the issue of gun control, and the two sides don't ever come up with any form of compromise. Like, I know right now in the Senate, there's a discussion that there's a bipartisan conversation about creating potentially a red flag law like they have in Florida, which is a step in the right direction. But is that going to be a significant policy change? Is that going to stop
smoke
mass
and
murders?
mirrors, Anthony? It's all smoke and mirrors is what that is. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, it's not going to stop mass murders.
No, it's not.
I was looking at the small arms survey earlier. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it talks about private gun ownership in the world. So I'm looking at it. If you haven't, or if you're not familiar with it, it's called the website smallsurveys.org, and it talks about gun ownership worldwide. So to give you an idea, on their 2020 survey, they talk about private ownership. Estimated total civilian held legal and illicit firearms in the top 25 ranked countries and territories. The United States has 393,300,000 guns in private hands, with a per capita of 120 guns per 100 people.
May I just interrupt you for one moment? That's a figure that was released through CBS one morning, because the number I got, just so we're clear, I heard there was 1 billion small arms on the planet. We had 40%, which alludes to about 400,000. CBS, you just stated 393. That's of 2020. The thing that's important here, Anthony, is that post-pandemic, and every time we have an incident, the gun sales skyrocket. There were, in the year, I believe, 2020, over 40 million NICS checks. A NICS check is the National Instant Criminal Background Check. It's a request to buy at least one gun. The following year, we think we replicated that, along with an excess of 10 million new gun buyers. So the number we're talking about, sir, you and I, 393, I think it's well above that, and I think it's pushing closer to 500 million guns in this country. But I just wanted to interject that. Anthony, if you'll allow me to take a quick break, sir, I want to come back to, and I want to get back on that number that we're talking about, weapons in America. We'll be right back, ladies and gentlemen. This is Between the Lines. We're back, and just to remind you, you can become part of this conversation, betweenthelines.tv. You know, please call in, send us emails. We want to hear what you have to say. We want to start to bring some sanity into these conversations. And I'm on today with the Doctor Anthony Fleming. Gentleman is professor, both undergraduate and graduate courses at the University of West Virginia. And he has a very interesting insight into the gun problem, which really translates to a cultural issue. So, Anthony, I rudely interrupted you, and I apologize, because I did want to interject the addition of these weapons that are in the system. Something else, Anthony, I forgot to mention. These guns referred to as assault rifles by the left, there's probably 40 to 50 million of them here. So I want you to finish that, your train of thought, and I apologize for interrupting you. But I also have another question. How do they plan to regulate them, like the horses out of the stall? Would you not say, sir?
Yeah, I've actually used that exact analogy before when I'm talking about gun policy course. So, you know, the horse is out of the barn and it's reproduced 50 million times. So we don't even know how many horses there are, right? So I don't know how we're going to regulate it. There's so many in circulation already. As you said, that the 393 million is a conservative estimate. I would agree. That's 300. I would say it's, as you say, 500 million easily. Yeah, sorry. I kind of lost my train of thought with that. I apologize.
No, that's all right. No, we were just talking about the volume of these weapons in here and the impasse in the government. That's why I had suggested that the federal government create more of a voice and say, this is what we want to introduce the public to. We want to put on a program that if you comply with vetting similar to that of law enforcement, we're prepared to issue you a concealed weapons permit with the same form of reciprocity of a driver's license. In other words, we have to start to do something from keeping people who are mentally ill and emotionally disturbed from getting firearms, Anthony. And in addition to that, maybe we need to visit the HIPAA law The HIPAA law is hamstringing us also because we have a lot of people that are being diagnosed with personality disorders, schizophrenic, any number of mental conditions that lend itself to them not owning firearms. I don't know if you've given that any thought yourself, but I'd be curious to hear your input.
Yeah, I've thought about the HIPAA aspect of it, especially when it comes to mental health. That goes into a whole conversation about privacy, which goes beyond firearms. So then that gets very complicated. Again, and when you talk about the compromise position, why can't the federal government come up with something that makes sense that we can approach, like your idea of national concealed carry with reciprocity, but with having to meet certain standards. And this to me is where I've always went back into what I've tried to understand. How do you get members of Congress in particular? How do you get them to work together across the aisle? Because unless you have a supermajority in the Senate of Democrats and you have a very strong control with the House and you have a Democratic president, I don't know how to make sweeping legislation in the United States. I've told people a number of times, if you think that gun control is going to happen, you're going to have the Republicans where they cannot interject in the House, the Senate, or the presidency, because if they do, it will lead to stalling out. It won't happen. Common sense, and that's when you talk about common sense approaches, it is common sense to you, maybe common sense to me, but it doesn't mean it's common sense to our policymakers. And that's where it all gets extremely frustrating, because most of people who identify in the middle can say, yes, this is a problem, but to get the people in power who are making these decisions to make a decision to benefit the middle or the majority of people, I don't know how to get them to do it.
You're right. I think what you and I are both acknowledging is that there is an ineptness in the government. Something that they just have to come to terms with is that the likelihood of eliminating firearms from this culture is probably as I would say available to them as me doing brain surgery in the morning, which is why it would behoove all of us, especially our children, if we could get them to get to a mindset where we can start to at least have a conversation. I understand exactly what you're saying. One of my clients happens to be a former governor, and because of him, I'm in D.C. quite a bit. D.C. can't move a paperclip from one table to the next without a series of pigeons, flying messages, emails, text messages. It's just incredible how bogged down we are. But the thing that concerns me is that, this is just one topic that we're having a problem with. You brought up some other interesting points that I want to go back to. I'm just rattling my brain from the beginning of the conversation. It was in my head and it just left. But we're in a crisis here. I think you would agree with that. I do want to ask you a question, not to put you on the spot, but what is your position regarding the public owning these assault weapons, as they're referred to on the left, or sporting rifles, as they're referred to on the right? What's your feeling on that?
So, for me, I don't know what an assault rifle is, and I hate to sound like I'm quibbling with you, but for me, if you look at the definitions for assault rifles, is it a fully automatic weapon? If it's a fully automatic weapon, no, I don't have any support for the public owned. Is it a semi-automatic weapon? Does it have to have a certain number of military features to it, or certain features? Like, I own rifles. I don't own anything that I think anyone would consider an assault rifle. I have a deer rifle. That's a Springfield 30-06, but it is a semi-automatic, but it only holds 4 bullets. Now, if we're talking about semi-automatic weapons, then yes, I think that the public should be allowed to have those. Are we talking about machine guns? No, I'm somewhere in the middle. I don't know if that helps answer your question, but that's where I fall.
No, you know what, and that's a very feasible, honest answer, because I think it's another topic that needs to have some discussion applied. The thing that I'm sure you're aware of is that the vast majority of this country are what we call Class 3 states, where you can, through a $200 tax stamp, I believe it is, acquire a full automatic weapon. And, here's one of the problems also, Anthony, and I think you might agree with this. The people that are pro high-capacity semi-automatic rifles, for the lack of better identification, they're witnessing this country and the world arm an entire country, the Ukraine, with the very same weapons they're trying to ban here. And by the way, they're addressing the very same concerns that our founding fathers articulated: tyranny and foreign invasion. I think you'll agree with that. So, it would behoove us to just, I don't want to say put our differences aside, but try to have some type of an intelligent conversation regarding this. If you look at the structure of the United States, and West Virginia is one of those states that's a pro-gun state. Go scour the southern United States, go from east to west. I have to say something else. You brought up California. They have very restrictive gun laws. I am intimately aware of them because of my background. They're having mass shootings on a regular basis. They have crime in their major cities like Los Angeles. It's at epic proportion. I don't understand what people don't understand about the truth. I always use this expression, you have to see the forest for the trees. I think you're hitting on a very, very important aspect of this conversation, and that seems to revolve around the lack of willingness in Washington, D.C. to sit down and put your big boy pants on and start to problem solve for the sake of our children. I don't know where to go with this conversation. Like, you and I could talk about it all day long. You and I both know the pitfalls. We know the arguments. I say do something. Do something to motivate, and this is my position. I don't necessarily believe that the how would you say, banning of particular weapons is going to fix the mental health problem, Anthony. And that's what's really driving this. The common denominator to every mass shooting is mental health. But I do want to say something else here that you'll probably find entertaining. For the purpose of the left who are anti-gun, they're now referring to mass shootings. Involved in that statistic are these shootings that take place in Chicago and Philadelphia on a weekly basis, and New York and D.C. and various other countries. It's not part of the mass shooting. These shootings are attached to gang, turf wars, narcotics. These are attached to crimes of fruition. People that go in and shoot up schools like we just witnessed in Uvalde, Valley, that's not a crime of fruition. It's just like sexual assault. It's not a crime of fruition. They need to stop insulting our intelligence and tell us the truth for once. But more importantly, take up the mantle that you and I are talking about and try to figure out how to problem solve here. Instead of feeding this polarization on this topic. And all they do is politicize it. I mean, it's disgusting, the behavior of some of these people that are elected officials. It's incumbent upon them to engage in conversations that are fruitful for the sake of our children, if for no other reason. And it's just absent from the conversation. I didn't mean to put you on a spot in regards to the assault rifle. I do think it's important to know that we are so far out of a conversation of banning them. I'll tell you something interesting during the Obama administration. The Southern conservative Democrats, whose constituents are gun people, told him, I know what they did. They said, don't go near gun control. I think you're probably aware of that. We had the Newtown shooting, right? I was in Connecticut with CNN, who's been my client since 1996. Beyond description of heart-wrenching. You know what we got passed after that? Nothing. The president tried to pass closing the loophole at a gun show, which I'm sure you're familiar with.
Yep.
Couldn't get that done. And most Americans believe you shouldn't be allowed to go to a gun show, put down $500 and walk out with a gun without having any understanding of who you are. But if you're looking at the trending here, we're having states like the one you're from, West Virginia, Georgia, Tennessee, Texas, Indiana. It's across the country. We don't know anything about you, and we're giving you permission to buy and carry a concealed weapon. We're moving in the wrong direction. At what point are the people on the left going to realize, as you and I put it, the horse is out of the stall, and try to enter into some kind of dialogue that lends itself to some method to the madness? That's my position on this thing. I mean, you're far more learned, and I know you've done a lot more research in these areas. I just try to keep things kind of basic and attached to common sense, logic, and reason, and most importantly, the truth. The truth attached to this, you just pointed out. We're not getting anything done in government. So here's the question. What's the answer? Do we throw our hands up and just surrender?
So two things. One thing I want to say as a comment, the Newtown shooting, I remember a year after the Newtown shooting, reading an article somewhere that states had passed something like 120 laws in response to Newtown. However, like 110 of those 120 actually made it easier to get a gun, not more difficult. So it was like a counter response to the Newtown shooting, as opposed to more restrictive controls that actually ease controls, which I found fascinating. Not necessarily in a good way, but fascinating. The other, my argument that I made in my dissertation and my book was that culture is a factor in determining how we make gun policy. However, I think the design of our institutions are more of a problem, because when the founder, you talked about tyranny earlier, when the founders created the Constitution, they want to make certain there can never be a tyrant. So they created what I tell when I teach Intro to American Government to my students, I tell them the founders created a system of government that is designed not to work most of the time. They don't want the prime minister like you get in Canada to be able to force through policy whenever they want. So policy success rate in the United States is extremely low, and it's got worse. So where the founders, I think, what they wanted was moderates to win the day. Now you have either the right or the left strangling it, and have all these veto points that prevent legislation from coming in. It also allows veto points for powerful interest groups to get in, where it used to be you would only need to have a committee chairman, like the head of the Judiciary Committee. If you could have, and I think I'm bad with names, I'm sorry, but he used to be the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. Was it Dingle? But he was also on the NRA's ruling council. So it's like, of course, you're not going to get much in the way of restrictive gun control policy making it through the House, I believe it was, with him sitting as the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. So you have situations like that where it's not all of Congress that's throttling legislation. It could be a single person throttling legislation.
I agree with you, buddy. Look, we're going to take a quick break. And when we first opened up, you briefly touched on gun sales surging after these incidents. Guys, we're going to be right back. This is Between the Lines. I have a gentleman on with us today, Doctor Anthony Fleming. I would only say very heavily invested in this discussion, not just about guns, but about America. He's bringing up some really interesting points. We'll be right back, guys. We're back, ladies and gentlemen. I have with us today Dr. Anthony Fleming. He's a professor, undergraduate and graduate studies at the University of West Virginia. I want to give him an opportunity to mention some books shortly, but early in this conversation, very early, I think we were alluding to the fact that post incidents like we just experienced in Uvalde, the gun sales skyrocket. I mean, have you conducted research as to why that is, Dr. Fleming?
I have not done research, but I have a pretty good idea what happens. I remember after Newtown, I was asked, why are police departments having a difficult time getting ammunition for their guns? And it's because after a mass shooting, you hear politicians start talking about gun control. So people hurry up, go to gun shops and buy as much guns and ammo as they can because they're afraid it's going to get banned. So it's a fear response from people who think that they're going to have their firearms taken away from them. I don't know the numbers on this, but my guess is that whenever you have Democrats in control of government, you're going to have higher gun sales than when Republicans are in control, because there's going to be less fear at those periods of time for firearms being banned. That's just a guess.
You know what, Dr. Fleming, I think you hit on a very interesting point in this conversation, but I want to expand on it if I may, and then I want to give you an opportunity to promote your books and just to speak a little bit more in a way that would be advantageous to you. It isn't just the fear that they're going to lose their guns, quote unquote. I believe the American public feels that when they need the police, for example, they're not going to be there. I also think there's this intense distrust of the government. Today, more than ever, you just have to look at the way we're operating. You know, we can't seem to get on the same sheet of music. So once again, I think there's more than one cause to the way people consume firearms. I want to ask you if you just want to tell us a little bit about some of your publications, if you don't mind.
Sure. So I'll be quick. So I published a book back in 2012 comparing the United States and Canada and their responses to mass murder events with firearms and assassinations.
What's the name of that book, sir?
It's a very exciting title. It's a gun policy in the United States and Canada, the impact of mass murders and assassinations on gun policy.
Okay.
So it's the cover is also extremely exciting, green and white. it's not. I'm sorry. And currently, I'm writing a book that hopefully will be in print sometime in 23. And I'm bad with names. I believe that we're calling it Aiming for Freedom or Shooting for the Common Good. And what we're going to do in this book, me and my co-author, Dylan McLean, is we're looking at the historical evolution of how the pro-control people and the pro-gun people have framed and argued the debate over time to try to get their side to win. It's basically the chess match that the two sides have played with each other for decades to try to see who can gain dominance. And hopefully that we'll get that in print in 23. We're in the editing phase now.
I just want to say one thing to you that, I always ask people to come back on this show. I really, really would like you to come back because this is a conversation that needs to continue. You have rather interesting insight. Something else I think our listeners should really understand is that this gentleman on the phone is involved in teaching our children about this gun management issue and about our culture. It's a really interesting conversation that I'm fearful is becoming an indictment of our culture in many ways. We just seem to be at an impasse, whether it's the borders, the crime in your city, the economy, or foreign policies, firearms, pro-choice, you pick it. We just can't seem to get on the same sheet of music. But I would like you to come back on this program with us at some point. I apologize if I dominated this conversation. I didn't intend to, but I do realize that once I get talking on this topic, it strikes a chord with me because I've been in the law enforcement community for 49 years. And, I have children that are school age. That's all I'm going to say to you. I got married late, Anthony, and my baby just turned 10, so my heart's in my mouth half the time. But I do want to thank you for taking or putting efforts into teaching children about this very, very sensitive issue. And you have a very good insight as to what the problem is. The question is, can we change this conversation in D.C.? Is it a possibility? Or are we just going to go in this circle, keep chasing our tail? The other thing is next time I'm hoping we can do this by Zoom. I blame the producers here for this, not me. I don't have my fingerprints on anything in a Zoom failure. I want you to know that. But I do want you to definitely come back, and I'm going to give you more of an opportunity to speak. I want to give you any closing comments or anything you'd like to say before we end.
I appreciate it. I definitely like to be back. One thing, I just wanted to add one quick point about something that you said earlier, and that is that Americans have always had feared government, and that's one of the reasons we created our institutions the way that we did, and that fear of government has never gone away. So that's my last point. And
that's a pretty interesting statement, In any case, I want to thank you for joining us today. You are a gentleman and a scholar, I might note. Gentleman's a PhD, ladies and gentlemen. This is a very learned individual. In any case, this has been Lou Palumbo. This has been Between the Lines. I encourage you guys to please call in or email, and you can reach us at betweenthelines.tv. We also have a show in Jacksonville, Mondays and Tuesdays, live from 5 to 6 o'clock. In fact, I wouldn't mind having you come on and speak to this topic on this show at 5 o'clock. It's a live 1-hour show. And people need to, start to understand what's driving this. The show, by the way, is on a network, WBOB. You'll find it 600 AM or 101.1 FM. I thank you so much, Dr. Fleming, and I hope that we can engage in conversation. This is not going away. I know you know that, and we need to have some type of intelligent discourse on this topic, guys. Thank you for joining us, guys, and we'll see you next week.